And again, from the first to last, the teaching of Amenemope seems to show that his official religious views were based on the old solar cult of Heliopolis, and that his personal religion was of the same character as that of the great scribes and sages of that city who flourished under the ancient empire. Passages like that in which he discusses good and evil in relation to God link him with the religious philosophers of that period. There is little doubt that he lived before Amenhotep III gave his powerful support to the cult of Aten, the physical body of the sun god. It is clear that he adopted the views current as to the power of this god, for he advises his readers and hearers to pray to him daily for health and strength, because he will give them everything necessary for their life and physical well-being. But he does not ascribe to him the powers which Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, and his followers claimed for him, and he reserves his admiration and wonder for the might and majesty of Ra, as displayed in the physical works of creation. He cannot have been an Atenite, and the cult of Amen, or Amen-Ra, which was predominant in the Thebaid under the Xvid dynasty, cannot have appealed to him, or in some way or other he would certainly have made mention of that god in his teaching. He was certainly no devoted Amenite. But Budge's analysis, which, as others were quick to note, was based on literary rather than linguistic criteria, was given short shrift by almost everyone else in the field. In fact, since both of the witnesses to Amenemope known at the time, Papyrus 10,474 and the Turin Tablet, were manifestly late, most scholars considered it quite reasonable to ascribe a late date to the original composition as well. Ehrman originally declined to commit himself to a specific date, saying only that the presence of Amenemope in the scribal schools at the time of the Turin Tablet showed that the original composition could not be later than the 8th or 9th century BC, 0.8. Shortly thereafter, he suggested a date around the beginning of the 10th century, i.e. the 21st dynasty, while Gressman placed it around 900 BCE, the 22nd dynasty. Lange argued for a much later date of composition, just as he had pushed for an exceedingly late date for Papyrus 10,474 itself. He declared that the language of Amenemope could hardly be older than the 22nd dynasty, and perhaps is a great deal younger, by which he seems to have meant that it belonged to the Persian or even the Greco-Roman eras. This assessment was based in large part on his belief that some of the author's vocabulary was not otherwise attested until those times. But, as Ruffel correctly observed, it is doubtful if this is as significant as Lange appears to think. There are several words which are common in the Greco-Roman period, but of which one or two occurrences are known in works of indubitably earlier date, and it would be wrong to maintain that because a word is otherwise unknown before a certain period, it must date to that period and not before. Griffith, on the other hand, noted that the personal names given to the members of Amenemope's family, his father, Connacht, his wife Taosret, and his son Harmakeru, could argue for a somewhat earlier date. Unfortunately, all that Griffith felt he could safely conclude from the rather significant body of Amenemope was that no firm conclusion could be drawn. These names give us singularly little help in determining the date of the composition. They conduct us at once to a period not earlier than the 18th dynasty, but leave us in doubt thereafter, although collectively they give the impression of a later date, say 21st to 26th dynasty. It is of course conceivable that the names are fictitious. Thus ended the first phase of the efforts to establish a firm date for the composition of the Instruction of Amenemope. Given the amount of effort invested in the question and the quantities of ink spilled over its discussion, it would be fair to say that the results were somewhat less than satisfactory.
Dating the original composition, the second phase.
For the next 3 decades, the question of dating was largely held in abeyance while scholars focused on the issue of Amenemope's relationship with the biblical book of Proverbs, a topic which we will take up in depth in the next chapter. Only in the 1950 Essen and 1960 Essen did scholars return in force to the question of when the Instruction of Amenemope was originally composed. By then, the Egyptological landscape had changed considerably. The publication of West Semitic texts from the archaeological excavations at Ugarit had provided new insights into the composition and dating of Hebrew literature, and there was now a much greater appreciation of the international character of all the so-called wisdom literatures of the ancient Near East, and especially the instructions. These new insights led Albright, writing in 1955, to summarize his own conclusions on Amenemope with one of his typical magisterial declamations. Actually, the name of Amenemope is most common in the New Kingdom, particularly in the 20th dynasty, while the name of his father, Connacht, is recorded for the New Kingdom but not later. In view of the otherwise complete drying up of Egyptian literary inspiration with the fossilizing of the classical tongue after the end of the Ramesside age, it is very risky to date the composition of the maxims of Amenemope after the end of the second millennium. On the other hand, the spelling of loan words, etc. precludes a date before the 12th century BC at earliest. In essence, Albright was proposing to place the composition of Amenemope within the latter two-thirds of the Ramesside era, between 1200 BC and 1000 BC. We shall see shortly just how close to the mark he actually was. Unfortunately, Albright's pronouncement, though ultimately proven correct, did not meet with universal approval. What was needed was not so much one man's expert opinion as hard evidence from multiple sources which could be objectively analyzed by the Egyptological community as a whole. Fortunately, this requirement was satisfied by the discovery and dissemination of several new witnesses to the text of Amenemope. Turin 62,007, a writing tablet containing lines 470 to 500. Luke A. 17,173, a writing tablet containing lines 34 to 37. Moscow I1D, a writing tablet with lines 15 to 115. Stockholm MM 18,416. Papyrus fragments with portions of 1,191 to 257. Kourou 1840, an Ostrakhan containing pieces of text from 47 to 66. Turin Sup 4661, a writing tablet containing only the title. A graffito in Medinet Habu, also containing only the title. Some of these witnesses had in fact been known to Egyptologists even prior to the publication of Papyrus 10,474, but their significance was not recognized until afterwards. Others were not made public until the 1960s or 1970s, but once they finally did become available, they forced a wholesale revision of the dating of Amenemope. Their dating on Amenemope, we will examine each one in turn.
The Turin writing tablet.
Turin 6237 is a student scribe's wooden practice tablet, approximately 6 by 12 inches, with an unplastered writing surface. At last report, it was housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy. Its place of origin is unknown. As in Papyrus 10,474, each verse line is written on the tablet as a separate physical line. The writing begins approximately two-thirds of the way down one side with lines 470 to 475, continues down the full length of the second side with lines 476 to 492, and then returns to the top of the first side again for lines 493 to 500, leaving a space in the middle of the first side, sufficient for another 3 lines. This peculiar pattern is an artifact of the way in which such tablets were used. The student scribe began his lessons at the top of the first side and continued until it was filled, turned the tablet over and worked his way down the second side, then flipped back to the first side and erased enough space at the top to make room for a few more lines. Thereafter, he would work his way around and around the tablet in the same way, erasing and replacing a handful of lines at a time, so that at any given moment, the only space on the tablet devoid of writing would be the small area required for the next few lines. Assuming that this particular student had already thus worked his way through the entire body of Amenemope to the point where line 470 begins, and that he maintained an average of 17 lines per side, we can calculate that he had already written and erased 27 full sides of text, plus the two-thirds of a side already erased on the 28th, before reaching the point where the present text begins. One interesting feature of the tablet is that the student has noted the day number, presumably the day of the month, whatever month it was, at the end of several days' lessons. The earliest date shown, at the end of 474 or 475, is day 4. The latest, at line 500, is uncertain but can be no less than day 18. This means that it took our student at least 2 weeks to transcribe the 25 lines, from 476 through 500, a rate of less than 2 lines per day. At that rate, it would have taken him the better part of a year to complete all 550 lines. Furthermore, as Griffith and Posner both noted, there seems to be no relationship between the student's starting and stopping points on the one hand and the literary structure of the text on the other. The date tags indicate that he or his teacher, if the text was being dictated, was perfectly content to knock off work in the middle of a couplet. The Turin tablet was known to Egyptologists long before the publication of Papyrus 10,474, having been transcribed in part by Spiegelberg for his own private use in the 1890s, and then in full by Gardner around the year 1910 for Ehrman's Wörterbuch project in Berlin. At the time, of course, it was not known what larger work the tablet text had been copied from, because Budge's first publication of Amenemope was still in the future. Once Papyrus 10,474 was published, the text of the Turin tablet was almost immediately recognized as an excerpt from Amenemope, and it was identified as such in publications by both Spiegelberg and Ehrman. Gardner's transcription of the tablet was made available by Ehrman to Lange, who published it in 1925 as part of his German critical edition of Amenemope. Gardner himself provided a copy to Griffith, who made use of it in his English translation of 1926. In 1966, Posner published a new edition of the tablet's text, which was based on Gardner's original transcription, as published by Lange, supplemented and corrected from infrared photographs and his own direct examination of the original tablet. Gardner dated the Turin tablet to the 20th dynasty, or later, on the basis of the widespread use of the sign as a determinative. Spiegelberg thought the Turin tablet was only slightly earlier than Papyrus 10,474, which he considered to be from the 22nd dynasty. Griffith argued for a much later date, apparently based on his erroneous belief that the text of the tablet had been dictated directly from Papyrus 10,474 itself. Posner, however, working a generation later with much more comparative material at his disposal, opted for a date in the 25th or early 26th dynasty, i.e. between 747 and 650 BC. Williams concurred, stating that the tablet is probably from the 26th dynasty.
The Louvre writing tablet.
Another writing tablet with a text from Amenemope was also known before the publication of Papyrus 10,474, having been acquired by Philippe Viret in Thebes and published in 1886. It was donated to the Louvre in Paris by Viret's heirs, and now bears the inventory number E17173. The Louvre tablet is substantially smaller than the Turin tablet, measuring approximately 5 inches square, and contains the text of Amenemope through inscribed in 8 lines of black ink on a single side. It was broken down the middle and repaired in ancient times, as can be seen by the fact that the existing writing is spaced so as to avoid the break. As with the Turin tablet, the student scribe who wrote the Louvre tablet put each verse line on a separate physical line and inserted day numbers between the lines to mark his progress. Day 22, day 25, day 26, and day last equals day 30, the last day of every month. There are also 2 or possibly 3 unrelated personal names written in the blank spaces after the day tags. Viret's interpretation of the tablet was ingenious, if utterly wrong. He believed the text was a calendar of religious festivals, hence the day markers, and that the tablet had been deliberately broken in order to send it into the other world for the use of the deceased. Thus, the short text which it carries would allow the deceased, no doubt a priest, to continue in the other life the exercise of his sacerdotal ministry. It was only when Papyrus 10,474 was published that anyone realized the tablet was not a religious calendar at all, but an excerpt from the Instruction of Amenemope. The Louvre tablet, like all the Amenemope tablets, is unplastered. This strongly suggests that it cannot be earlier than the 21st or 22nd dynasty, when, as we saw in the previous chapter, such boards first came into vogue. This is confirmed by the personal names found on the tablet, apparently from a different exercise by the same student, which do not come into widespread use until that same period. On the other hand, the style of the hieratic script found on the tablet is attested only for the 22nd dynasty, so the date cannot be much later than that. Consequently, we may confidently place the Louvre tablet no earlier than the 21st dynasty, and probably no later than the 22nd.
The Moscow writing tablet.
A writing tablet in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, inventory number I1D equals Golenischev 3410, contains Amenemope 105 to 116. The tablet is approximately 5.5 by 8.5 inches and contains a few lines of the text on each side. The student scribe apparently began by writing Amenemope 105 through 111 as a continuous text in 4 complete lines and part of a 5th. He then flipped the tablet over and wrote 113 through 115 in the same manner on the verso, skipping line 112 in the process. The partially erased characters at the bottom of the recto side do not seem to come from Amenemope, but are the remains of some previous exercise. Posner speculated that it was the presence of these traces which forced the scribe to change sides in the middle of his work. The Moscow tablet was apparently not recognized in print as an excerpt from Amenemope prior to a brief mention in 1966 by Peterson, who had been alerted to the relationship by Posner. Shortly thereafter, Posner himself published the text based on his own personal examination of the now much deteriorated original, supplemented by a good set of photographs taken by Golenischev. On the basis of the physical construction of the tablet itself and the nature of the hieratic script employed by the student scribe who used it, Posner suggests a date for the Moscow tablet between the 23rd and 26th dynasties, with the latter end of the range being the more likely. This conclusion has subsequently been adopted by Williams, who gives the date as 25th or 26th dynasty. On the other hand, the writing on the Moscow tablet is continuous, with the verse lines separated only by verse points, which is, as we have already noted, a relatively earlier practice. The writing of poetic material at one verse line per manuscript line, such as we find in Papyrus 10,474, the Turin tablet, and the Louvre tablet, developed comparatively later. Posner suggested on this account that the Moscow tablet must have been written before the Louvre tablet, yet it was also Posner who placed the Louvre tablet in the 21st or 22nd dynasty, far earlier than his preferred date for the Moscow tablet. Oddly, neither he nor anyone who came after him seems to have noticed the blatant contradiction between these two positions. All things considered, the evidence for a later date is much stronger than that for an earlier one. The construction of writing tablets and the evolution of the written language both follow relatively clear chronological sequences, whereas continuous writing and explicit versification existed side by side for centuries. An individual scribe's decision to use one or the other might, therefore, be based on nothing more than a need to conserve writing materials or even a personal aesthetic preference, and in the face of more cogent evidence cannot be taken as decisive. We may, therefore, with reasonable confidence, place the Moscow tablet in the 25th or 26th dynasty.
The Stockholm fragment.
Stockholm's Museum of Mediterranean and Near Eastern Antiquities, the Medelhavsmuseet, possesses a set of papyrus fragments, MM 18,416, which contain portions of Amenemope 191 to 257. These fragments were acquired by Gustav Retzius during a vacation to Egypt in the winter of 1889-1890, deposited in the Stockholm Ethnographical Museum, and then transferred to the Medelhavsmuseet, where they were discovered by Peterson in 1963. It is possible, but not certain, that Retzius acquired the fragments in Cairo. The section of papyrus represented by the fragments measures about 5.5 by 9 inches and contains the remains of 2 columns of 16 lines each, written in a rather careless hand. Of the first column, which originally contained lines 191 through 222, only the last few characters of each line remain. Of the second column, which originally contained lines 223 through 257, approximately 2/3 of the beginning of each line remains. At the top and bottom of the second column, there are several characters of scribal corrections, at least some of which is in a different hand. As Peterson noted, this suggests that the Stockholm fragment, like the 3 writing tablets we have already discussed, was written by a student rather than a professional scribe. The text is written continuously, which is consistent with but does not prove a relatively early date. Peterson, citing the fragment's distinctive orthography and paleography, situated it in the 21st or 22nd dynasty, i.e., somewhere between 1069 and 712 BC. Point 115. This date has also been accepted by William.
The Cairo Ostracon.
Somewhere in the Cairo Museum is an ostracon, once catalogued as number 1840 but subsequently lost, which contains portions of Amenemope 47 to 66. It was first mentioned in print by Posner, then by Plumley, then by Williams, then by Peterson, and then by Posner again. All of them exciting private communications from Cerny. Unfortunately, the latter never got around to publishing the text. It finally saw print only after his death, in an article by Peterson based on information received by him from Cerny, including Cerny's handwritten copy of the text. The Cairo Ostracon is said to have come from Luxor/Thebes as part of a basket full of similar ostraca. The text was written on a fragment of a yellow grass clay pot with the handle still attached, and as found measured about 5.5 by 6.5 inches, although obviously it was once larger, since a substantial amount of the text it used to contain is now missing. On one side of the ostracon are 8 fragmentary lines of text from Amenemope, and 2 lines of an unrelated text written upside down and in a different hand. The other side is blank. The text from Amenemope is as follows. 1. A few signs from the end of 47. 2. The first half of 49. 3. Most of 51. 4. The second half of 54 and the beginning of 55. 5. Most of 57. 6. The last few signs of 60, all of 61 and the first signs of 62. 7. The first 2/3 of 64. 8. The last half of 66. It is easily seen from the above that roughly half of the original text has been lost, with approximately every other line missing. It is clear that the text was written continuously, i.e. without the explicit versification seen in Papyrus 10,474, the Turin tablet, and the Louvre tablet, which once again is consistent with a relatively early date. And indeed, Cerny was of the opinion, which he expressed privately to John Raffel and others, that the ostracon should be dated to the late XXist, or possibly early XXX in dynasty. As Raffel noted, Cerny's authority on this subject is unquestionable, and subsequent commentators have indeed accepted it without question.
A second Turin tablet.
In 1973, Posner announced the discovery of another brief text of Amenemope on a writing tablet found by Schiaparelli during his 1905-1906 excavations at Khao el-Kabir, ancient Cebu Greek, Antiopolis, about 120 miles north of Thebes. The tablet, which is housed in the Turin Museum with an inventory number of SUP+ 4661, is approximately 3.5 by 7.5 inches and unplastered. Only one side is written on, and that side contains nothing more than the title of the work, The Beginning of the Instruction in Life, inscribed in black ink along one edge. Once again, the physical construction of the tablet allows it to be dated with relative assurance to the 25th or 26th dynasty, and once again we are obviously dealing with a schoolboy's lesson. Posner originally suggested that the resemblance of the tablet's inscription to the first line of Amenemope might be fortuitous, since the expression instruction for life, an anxious inclination also found at Amarna. His hesitation on this point led to similar doubts for several subsequent commentators. Later, however, he seemed more confident that the inscriptions from both the Second Turin tablet and Medinet Habu, described below, were in fact quotations from Amenemope.
The Medinet Habu graffito.
In the second court of the Great Temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in western Thebes, on the south half of the east wall, there is a large hieratic graffito, approximately 30 inches long and 15 inches high, containing the same text as the Second Turin tablet, i.e. the beginning of the instruction in life. Obviously, the graffito must be younger than the temple itself, which was built during the 20th dynasty. The individual characters seem to match most closely the hieratic writing of the 22nd dynasty, and such a date also comports well with what we know about the history of Medinet Habu. The Great Temple seems to have been designed from the outset not only as a mortuary temple for Ramesses III, but also as a military fortress, and almost from the time of its construction, it served as the administrative center for the West Bank of Thebes. It was only natural, therefore, that when the political and economic situation in Upper Egypt began to deteriorate toward the end of the 20th dynasty, the inhabitants of the area began to move close to, and even into, the Medinet Habu fortress as a way of protecting themselves against local marauders and Nubian invaders. For example, the families of the workmen's community at nearby Deir el-Medina, which had been in existence since the early 18th dynasty, abandoned their homes for the fortress during the reigns of the last Ramesside kings, although for a time they continued to perform maintenance work on the necropolis from their new base of operations. By the 22nd dynasty, therefore, the Great Temple had long since ceased to be used as a place of worship, and its interior spaces had been appropriated for other uses. Under such circumstances, it is not hard to imagine a scribe from one of the Medinet Habu administrative offices proudly displaying his literacy by scratching the opening line of Amenemope onto the walls of what had once been the forbidding inner recesses of the famous temple, but now were reduced to a warren of offices and private apartments.
Drawing a conclusion.
We are now in a position to collate the data from all the known witnesses to the Instruction of Amenemope in roughly the order of their writing. It is noteworthy that our most complete witness to Amenemope, Papyrus 10,474, is also the latest, which, given the progressive destruction of materials over time, is perhaps not surprising. It also suggests that, insofar as changes have been made to the text by error or intention, they should be most prominent in Papyrus 10,474, while the other witnesses as a whole should represent an earlier form of the text. This, too, seems to accord with the evidence. As the table above demonstrates, the earliest copies of Amenemope date from the 21st or 22nd dynasties. Most notable of these is the Cairo-Ostracon, which Cerny firmly dated to the late 21st or early 22nd dynasty, i.e. roughly the century from 1000 to 900 BC. It is certain, therefore, that the original composition of Amenemope must have taken place prior to that century. Furthermore, the fact that the earliest witnesses to Amenemope are school texts, or, as Williams put it, schoolboy copies, and that they have been found in widely scattered locations, Thebes in Upper Egypt, Antiopolis in Middle Egypt, the Fayum in Lower Egypt, means that the original composition of the instruction must have taken place significantly earlier than any of our witnesses, i.e., far enough in advance of them for the text to be disseminated throughout the land and become common in scribal instruction. Given the inherent conservatism of Egyptian society as a whole, and of scribal instruction in particular, we must allow, at a minimum, several generations for this to take place. R.J. Williams was one of the first to realize the importance of the new data. His first attempt in 1961 to date the composition of Amenemope had rightly emphasized that work's similarity to the Instruction of Ani, which he and others had already situated in the late 18th dynasty, as well as the importance of the Cairo. He thereby arrived at a date for Amenemope in the early part of the 19th dynasty. Subsequently, he expanded the range to include the 20th as well. Similarly, John Ruffle, writing around the same time, initially proposed a date for Amenemope in the 20th dynasty, which he later broadened to include the 19th. Subsequently, the conclusions of Williams and Ruffle, and others who followed the same logic, became the accepted wisdom, with similar dates for the composition of Amenemope being affirmed by Marzal, 19th dynasty, Bayerlin, 20th dynasty, Wente, 11th to 11th dynasty, and Brunner, 11th to 11th century BC. The most recent effort to tackle the dating problem systematically is that of Harold Washington in 1994. In addition to the evidence discussed above about Amenemope's use of personal names and the dating of the individual witnesses, Washington added a detailed analysis of Semitic loanwords and also drew on the observations of Blackman and Grumach about the use of chapter headings. The result, once again, was a finding that Amenemope must have been composed in the 20th dynasty. Caprice 1, 8611069 BC. In addition, Washington has provided a comprehensive account of the social and economic ills which plagued Egypt during this period, thereby making an excellent case that many passages of Amenemope were designed to address specific difficulties and temptations facing the scribes of that era.
Dating by literary historical development.
In the work described above, a few scholars, notably Budge, Wente, Brunner, and Romheld, derived their conclusions at least in part from literary or thematic considerations. But for the most part, the efforts over the past 75 years to determine a date for Amenemope's composition have been based on small-scale linguistic elements, primarily the vocabulary, orthography, and paleography of the witnesses. While these efforts ultimately led to a broad consensus situating Amenemope in the Ramesside era, the subjectivity of such analyses leaves us with some measure of uncertainty. It would therefore be useful to approach the problem from a different perspective and see if we arrive at the same results. One possibility is to follow Albright's example and try to date the composition of Amenemope by means of the chronology of large-scale literary developments in late Egyptian. As we have already discussed in the previous chapter, the Egyptian language went through several thousand years of evolutionary development, during which time the spoken and written languages were almost always out of sync with each other. Further, the written language was deliberately subjected to external constraints, which kept its development from being linear, and even caused it to loop back on itself. The first of these constraints was the freezing of the official language in the phase now called Middle Egyptian, i.e., the Egyptian of the Middle Kingdom, Golden Age, while the vernacular continued to develop into Late Egyptian. As a result, formal documents continued to be composed in a variant of Middle Egyptian for centuries after this ceased to be the language of the people, much as Latin continued to be used for scholarly and liturgical purposes in Europe long after the rise of national vernaculars. It was only with Pharaoh Akhenaten's first official proclamations at his new capital of Akhetaten, ca. 1345 BC, that it became acceptable to use late Egyptian vocabulary and syntax in formal writing. And since the Instruction of Amenemope was itself composed in a variant of late Egyptian, although admittedly not a strongly typed one, it inevitably follows that it cannot have been written any earlier than the middle of the 14th century. But of course, this is still much too early. Literary innovations tend to be adopted slowly, especially in a tradition-bound society such as ancient Egypt. So it is extremely unlikely that the first literary works in late Egyptian were rolling off the presses shortly after Akhenaten first legitimized the use of late Egyptian in formal composition. In fact, the earliest evidence for the acceptability of the new linguistic norms after the Amarna collapse is from the reign of Horemheb, and the first physical evidence of literary manuscripts in late Egyptian comes from the middle of the 19th dynasty, about 50 years after Horemheb's reign. We may therefore put the earliest possible date for the composition of Amenemope at approximately 1240 BC. The history of literary writing in Egypt after the Amarna era also allows us to set a definite limit on the latest possible date of Amenemope's composition. While the emergence of late Egyptian as a literary language led to a temporary increase in both the quantity and the variety of literary production, it also created a permanent dichotomy between the old literary works written in Middle Egyptian and the new ones written in late Egyptian. And ultimately, this seems to have had dire consequences on both sides of the divide. The old Middle Egyptian literary texts, which had once enjoyed a canonical status, were in effect downgraded after Amarna to merely classical, while most of the late Egyptian literary texts seem to have been considered mere entertainment and hence disposable. As a result, except for the instructions, notably Amenemope itself, very few New Kingdom literary compositions in late Egyptian seem to have survived the demise of the 20th dynasty. And after the 21st dynasty, late Egyptian virtually ceased to be used as a literary language at all. It therefore follows that Amenemope, which is written in an early form of late Egyptian, cannot have been composed after the end of the 21st dynasty, which took place around 945 BC. On literary historical grounds alone, we may therefore comfortably date the original composition of Amenemope to sometime between 1240 and 945 BC. This agrees quite nicely with the scholarly consensus based primarily on linguistic criteria, which places Amenemope's composition in the late 19th or 20th dynasties, i.e., somewhere between the reigns of Ramesses II, 721, 2 c and Ramses 1-1098-1070 BC. As William so aptly put it, the original composition can hardly be later than the 20th dynasty. We may then assign it with some confidence to the 12th or even 13th century BC. Hence, there is no reason to suppose that the text was unknown in the days of Solomon. With this important result in hand, we are almost ready to tackle the complex and much controverted issue of the relationship between the instruction of Amenemope and the biblical book of Proverbs, which is the subject of the next chapter. Before we can do that, however, we need to take a closer look at Amenemope and his family as they are presented in the instruction, which bears his name.
Authorship and authenticity.
As we saw in Chapter 2, the instructions are unusual among Egyptian literary works in being ascribed, for the most part, to specific named individuals. The instruction of Amenemope is no exception to this rule, but just as the attributions of most of the other instructions have been doubted and even rejected by modern scholarship, sometimes with ample justification, and sometimes on the basis of little more than incorrigible skepticism, so also questions have been raised about the authorship of Amenemope. Was it really, as the text claims, written by a resident of Akhmem named Amenemope, son of Connacht and husband of Tawosret, for his son Harmakheru? Or is this attribution, like that of so many other Egyptian literary works, merely a fictional device? The identity of individuals in ancient Egypt is typically determined by three elements: their names and the names of their parents, spouses, and children, their offices and titles, and their geographical location. All of these are precisely specified in the opening lines of Amenemope, which suggests to some that they must describe real human beings. The majority opinion, however, seems to be that Amenemope is a pseudonym, and that the details of his life are merely concocted for literary effect. Griffith, for example, rather cautiously allowed as far back as 1926 that the names of Amenemope and his family might be fictitious. More recently, and much more forcefully, both Grumach and Washington have argued that while Amenemope portrays its author as someone who lived in the indeterminate past in the town of Akhmim and wrote the text for the instruction of his son, the work was in fact composed by a Theban scribe who wrote the text for scribal students destined for various levels of state service. But before we can accept such a sweeping conclusion, we need to determine whether the evidence actually supports it. The name Amenemope first appeared in the 18th dynasty. Since final N had already disappeared in the spoken language by this time, Amenemope would have been pronounced without it, even though the orthography remained unchanged. There is also considerable evidence that the internal nasals were assimilated, so that the name would have been pronounced more like Amenemopo or Amenepi than Amenemope. The name means Amun in the enclosure, where the enclosure or ipt is short for Intryt or the southern enclosure, i.e. the temple of Amun at Luxor in southern Thebes. Here, in highly secret annual rites, the king privately worshipped Amun in the form of the pre-dynastic fertility deity Min, whose cult had apparently been brought to Egypt from Mesopotamia by way of the Red Sea. Min's first seat of worship in Egypt was the city of Gebtu, Greek Koptos, modern Kift, the capital of the 5th Upper Egyptian nome, where he was already, along with Horus, the patron deity in pre-dynastic times. As the city lay at the western mouth of the Wadi Hammamat, Upper Egypt's main route to the sea, it was the natural place for an imported deity to find a home. From Gebtu, Min was brought to Ipu/Kent Min, modern Akhmim, known to the Greeks as both Chemis and Panopolis. This was the capital of the 9th Upper Egyptian nome, where, as the city's name suggests, Min assumed the role of chief deity. Finally, sometime around the beginning of the First Intermediate Period, the cult of Min was carried to Thebes, where he was worshipped under the name of Amun, and ultimately received the southern enclosure as his temple. While the name Amenemope thus began as a technical term for the specific manifestation of Amun Min at Luxor, it soon made the transition to human ranks and became increasingly popular thereafter, surviving all the way down to Ptolemaic times. It is especially common in the records of the 20th dynasty and in scribal literature. Unfortunately, the name's widespread and prolonged popularity makes it useless for purposes of determining either authenticity or dating, other than to place it sometime after the start of the New Kingdom. The name of Amenemope's father, Connacht, Aknhtex equals strong bull, is found as a personal name as early as the Middle Kingdom. It is, however, attested primarily in the New Kingdom, when it was also a component of the Horus names of many of the pharaohs of the 18th through the 23rd dynasties. After that, it largely fell out of use. It is widely attested among commoners in the late Ramesside era, and was found among the workmen of Deir el-Medina. Similarly, the name of Amenemope's wife, Tuosret, equals the powerful one, was common from the 18th dynasty on, and was the birth name of the famous wife of Seti II, who usurped the throne and ruled as queen in her own right at the end of the 19th dynasty. Both of these names, especially when taken together, seem to situate Amenemope firmly in the later New Kingdom, but could be found as easily, indeed perhaps more easily, at Thebes than at Akhmim. On the other hand, the name of Amenemope's son Harmakeru equals Horus is justified, Greek A.R. Maxarov, is otherwise unknown until the late period. Significantly, one of the best attested instances of the name comes from Akhmim, the alleged home of Amenemope. Not far from that ancient city there is a rock-cut temple of Min, which is thought to have originated with Thutmose III in the 18th dynasty. During the reign of Ai, the successor of Tutankhamun, a first prophet of Min named Nachtmin decorated the temple with reliefs depicting Ai and his wife before the gods. A millennium later, the Greek king Ptolemy II Philadelphos was depicted at the same temple in the same fashion by a chief priest of Min named Harmakeru. The fact that local traditions of religious art thus remained unchanged at Akhmim from the New Kingdom all the way down to the Ptolemaic era demonstrates the stability of the priestly traditions there. Hence, the association in the latter era of the name Harmakeru with Akhmim and its god Min strongly suggests the legitimacy of a similar association at the time of Amenemope's composition. Furthermore, the relative rarity of the name before the late period makes it less likely that it would be seized upon by a New Kingdom fabricator of names and titles, and hence much more likely that the personal names in Amenemope represent real people. The titles ascribed in Amenemope to the author and his family have given rise to even more doubt and speculation than the name. Griffith and Lengs both felt that the titles were more poetic than real. Washington, following in their footsteps, claimed that of the titles attributed to Amenemope in the Prologue, only 2 are attested elsewhere: Overseer of the Fields, Imior Zetat Wa, 1.13.3. The remainder of the titles are apparently literary paraphrases of various duties of scribes in the pharaonic administration. A single scribe would not have fulfilled all these duties. The titles show, rather, that the text is meant to instruct members of the scribal profession who work in a wide range of capacities. When the evidence is examined more closely, however, not one of these assertions turns out to be correct. The Instruction of Amenemope credits its author with a number of formal titles and job descriptions. We will examine these in greater detail when we study the Prologue in Section 2. For now, we may summarize them as follows. Overseer of lands. Overseer of grain, who regulates the grain measure, who levies the crop assessment for his lord, who registers new shorelands in the great name of his majesty, who establishes markers upon the boundaries of the fields, who protects the king with his inscriptions, who maintains the land register of Egypt, scribe, who places offerings before all the gods, who gives endowments to others, overseer of grain, who distributes provisions, who supplies the storehouses with grain. The first formal title attributed to Amenemope is one of those listed by Washington. Imiar Zatque equals Overseer of Lands, line 13. Lang noted that the same title, with a slightly different orthography, is attested on a late-period statue in the Cairo Museum, note 36,919. Similar titles are also known from other times and places, including Emir KMT equals Overseer of Black Land, Emir IHT equals Overseer of Cultivable Lands, 182, and especially Emir AHWT equals Overseer of Fields. The next formal title is Emir NFR GZ GZWD at equals Overseer of Grain, who regulates the grain measure. Line 15, the line is written entirely in red, This presumably indicates that the author, or perhaps the copyist, considered this particular title as one of the most important that Amenemope possessed. While it is true that this precise title has not been recorded elsewhere, a similar one is known from the tomb inscription of the Old Kingdom nomarch Henk, who wrote, "I was the overseer of grain, in Myar, small." Next we have what appears at first glance to be a religious title. ZS Wabe, HTTP, public, Z, NNT, Z, Wabe. Describe who places offerings before all the gods, line 22. This is the second title on Washington's list. He cites Lang, who compared it to a roughly similar title on a statue in the Cairo Museum. Griffith, however, pointed out that the exact title given in Amenemope can be found in a 20th dynasty onomasticon. Surprisingly, it is there placed not among the nomenclature for priests and temples, which is where we might expect to find it, but rather among the titles of secular bureaucrats attached to the palace. This suggests that the office was not a religious one at all, but rather a secular appointment, which included responsibility for the distribution of foodstuffs from government storehouses to the temples, where they were sacrificed to the gods, before being reverted for use in the offering rituals at private tombs. Finally, there is another overseer of grain title, line 24, written like the first such in red. Unfortunately, the line is too badly damaged to be read with certainty, but it apparently refers to Amenemope's role in controlling the local food supplies. This is consistent with the next line, which describes him as supplying the storehouses. This exhausts the formal titles ascribed to Amenemope in the prologue to his Instruction. All the other expressions that refer to him are either descriptions of the duties associated with one of the formal titles, or else personal epithets similar to those found in the tomb autobiographies. These will be analyzed further in Section 2. It is worth noting that all of Amenemope's titles and their associated job descriptions are closely related to a single subject: the regulation of arable land and the disposition of the grain grown on that land. It is hardly the case, as Washington claimed, that a single scribe would not have fulfilled all these duties. On the contrary, the scope of responsibility ascribed to Amenemope is tightly focused and well within the grasp of a mid-level bureaucrat, especially if he presided over an office of subordinate scribes who did the actual field work. Turning to Amenemope's son Harmakeru, we find the following formal titles and job descriptions, neatly arranged in a 1/3 parallelism. The Master of Secrets of Menkaumutef, who brings water for Winnofer, equals Osiris, who installs Horus upon the throne of his father, who serves him in his august shrine. Examiner for the mother of the god equals Isis, inspector of the black cattle of the terrace of Min, who protects Min in his shrine. At first glance, it is hard to see what all these various descriptors have to do with one another, since they involve duties not only to Min, but also to Osiris, line 35, Horus, line 36, and Isis, line 39. But in fact, this makes perfect sense in its historical and religious context. Min was often identified with Horus, was worshipped under the composite name of Min Horus, and was even addressed as Min, son of Isis. 180. In fact, Kamutef equals Kamwtf equals bull of his mother, one of the most characteristic titles of Min and also of Amun, was originally a title which belonged to Horus. We know from a reference in Papyrus Harris that there was a house of Min Horus and Isis at Ipu/Akhmim during the reign of Ramesses III, and not surprisingly, the identification between Min and Horus was also reflected in the names and titles assumed by the clergy there. In early times, numerous priests bore the name Huri, equals the two Horuses. In later times, titles such as First Prophet of Min Horus and Isis at Ipu and Prophet of Min Horus and Isis at Ipu are well attested, while a prophetess of Min Horus and Isis at Ipu is known from the 21st dynasty. It should also be noted that Ipu/Akhmim, the capital of the nome of Min, is no more than 25 miles by river from modern Gurga, which is thought to be the site of Tijan, the ancient capital of the nome of Osiris. So it would be only natural for the cults of the two nomes to have some influence on one another. That there was in fact a close relationship between the two in the New Kingdom is confirmed by the autobiography of Nebwawi, high priest of Osiris at Abydos under Amenhotep II, who recorded that, "On another occasion it was commanded me that I should go to bring forth in procession Horus, avenger of his father from the house of Min, lord of Ipu, at all his feasts in Ipu, I being there as chief of the prophets and all the workmen of the entire temple." Here we have a high priest of Osiris at Abydos, bringing the statue of Horus out of the temple of Min at Ipu/Akhmim in order to conduct a public procession at the festivals of Min. This certainly seems to clinch the case for the kind of close relationship between the cults of Horus and Min, which is suggested by Harmaheru's titles in Amenemope. The first formal title ascribed to Harmaheru is Hiri Z Sta En Min Wu Kfef equals Master of Secrets of Min, Bull of his mother. Line 34. The expression Chaizi Sta equals Master of Secrets was widely used in both royal and religious contexts, and masters of secrets of individual deities are well attested, including those of Ammon, Anubis, Osiris, Montu, Sekhmet, Hathor, Horus, and Thoth. A similar title explicitly associated with the god Min is attested from the Middle Kingdom, Hri Esestain Pri Panumi. Mi QDF equals Master of Secrets of the House of Min in its entirety. Among the duties of a temple's Master of Secrets were outfitting the statue of the god with fresh attire during the daily temple ritual and preparing the god for his processional journeys on festival days. As we shall see when we examine this section of the prologue in greater detail in section 2, these responsibilities are perfectly consistent with the other duties described in the rest of this first quatrain. The remains of what must have been a second formal title are found in line 38. Unfortunately, the manuscript is so badly damaged at this point that it cannot be restored, and the missing line is not found in any of the other witnesses. Judging from the descriptors in the next 3 lines, however, examiner, inspector, and protector, it must have had something to do with the oversight of temple property. Such responsibilities would dovetail nicely with the other duties of the Master of Secrets, who by virtue of his position would have been responsible for withdrawing expensive cult items from the temple stores when they were needed for the various rituals, and then making sure they were returned afterwards. So here again we see that Harmakeru's formal titles and job descriptions have a relatively tight focus, just as Amenemope's did. True to his priestly name and unlike his government bureaucrat father Amenemope, Harmakeru was clearly a priest of the Temple of Min, presumably in Akhmim, where he performed precisely the kinds of duties one would expect a priest to perform there. Finally, we have Harmakeru's mother, Tawasret, who is styled as ZX Maitnen Swat NWT equals Sistrum Player of Shu and Tefnut, line 44, and WT equals Chief Rhythmist of Horus, line 45. Both terms clearly indicate that Tawasret served as some sort of temple musician, and indeed in the New Kingdom women were so widely employed in such capacities that the second most common female title in mortuary texts is Smate, often translated simply musician. The title Smate is especially well attested among the women of the upper classes, most of whom must have been lay volunteers. However, since as far back as the Old Kingdom, there had also been a professional cadre of female musical specialists who were collectively referred to as the X-honor, or musical troupe, closely related to the verb xn, to clap, make music, or mark time. In the New Kingdom, the Exonar was headed by the Rart Exonar, or chief of the musical troupe, who was often of the wife of a high priest or other high public official. Significantly, Tawasret's second title, Rart Exon equals Chief Rhythmist, is closely related to the title Rart Exonar. Not only do the two expressions have the same grammatical construction, they are also derived from the same root, since DXN is a contraction of to make clapping. The role of female temple musicians, as the etymologies suggest, was to sing, clap, and above all to play the sistrum, the musical rattle sacred to the goddess Hathor. Sistra came in several varieties and had at least 2 distinct names. Zez, XM, from the sound the sistrum makes when it is played, and ZXM. From the latter is derived the first title borne by Tawasret, Zez XM, equals she of the sistrum or sistrum player. The title is attested outside of Amenemope in an oracular text from the 21st or 22nd dynasty, where a certain Ta'ahudi is described as the Zeksmit of Mut, maidservant of the temple of Horus the Child and ward of the temple of Mut. As for Amenemope ascribes to Tawasret, it is attested in abbreviated form on the walls of the great temple of Horus at Edfu. So in all three cases, Amenemope, his son Harmakaru, and his wife Tawasret, we find the same thing: formal titles which are attested elsewhere in the literature, either exactly or very closely, supplemented by job descriptions, which hang together logically and could easily have been within the professional purview of a single individual. The obvious conclusion, contrary to the claims of Griffith, Lange, Grumat, and Washington, among others, is that there is no good reason why these could not be the actual titles and job descriptions of real people. Finally, we should take a brief look at the geographical locations which Amenemope associates with its protagonists. These are 204. Taware, lines 26 and 31, the 8th Upper Egyptian nome, whose patron deity was Osiris. This was Amenemope's native nome, and his father, Connacht, was buried there, line 31. Tigeni, line 26, Greek Thinis, probably modern Gurga. This was apparently Amenemope's hometown. It also contained a temple of Shu, which was founded by Ramses III. This could well have been the venue where Tawasret served as a sistrum player of Shu and Tefnut. Abydos, line 29, Greek, Abydos. And so, the most important city, whose necropolis was believed to contain the tomb of Osiris, Amenemope had a cenotaph there. Ipu, lines 27 and 43, also called Kantamin, Greek Panopolis/Chemis, modern Akhmim, the capital of the 9th Upper Egyptian nome, would seem to be where Amenemope held office. Sinut, line 28, the necropolis of Ipu. This is where Amenemope had a tomb and expected to be buried. Kechumin, line 40, the terrace of Min, which was part of the holdings of the temple of Min at Ipu. Harmakaru was responsible for inspecting the black cattle which resided there. Other than a passing reference to Hermopolis, the hometown of the scribal deity Thoth, line 323, these are the only concrete geographical references in Amenemope. They all point to the same area, not, as one might expect, to the nation's literary and religious capital at Thebes, but rather to the region of the 8th and 9th nomes, which lay adjacent to each other approximately 100 miles downstream from Thebes. As we have already seen, the religious establishments of the two nomes were closely linked, and one may assume that civil affairs were similarly entangled. Hence, it would not be at all unusual for a resident of Tieni, such as Amenemope, to become a mid-level government bureaucrat in Ipu, nor would it be surprising for him to arrange a mid-level religious appointment for his son in the same city, where he himself held government office, and to arrange for his own tomb and burial there. This tight clustering of geographical references is thus quite plausible. Furthermore, these particular locations are strikingly consistent with the agricultural focus which pervades Amenemope, including both his own titles and his sons, since both of the nomes in question were known in ancient times for their agricultural production. A 20th dynasty inventory of temple personnel and an omasticon from the same period both mention the storehouses of Tigeni, while in other texts of the late period, the name of Ipu is prominently associated with granaries. What we discover then in a close examination of the names, titles, and locales ascribed to the protagonists of Amenemope is a remarkable consistency and plausibility. While one can always find reasons for doubt in such matters, the evidence strongly suggests that the personal details which the Instruction of Amenemope provides about its author and his family are credible and realistic. There is, therefore, no reason to discount them as poetry or literary fiction, and every reason to believe that they describe the persons and lives of real human beings who lived in Upper Egypt in the twilight years of the New Kingdom.